Good afternoon, everybody, and I'd just like to echo what Graham said. It's lovely to see so many people here, and many thanks to those of you that have travelled some distance, because having done the P1 to P2 trip a couple of times now and feared for my life on occasions on those roundabouts, I'm very, very grateful that some of you have managed to negotiate that trip today, so many, many thanks. As Graham mentioned, it's a real privilege to be here. As Graham mentioned, there'll be 64 of the staff across the two schools who will be trained as mental health first aiders, in fact, by this time next week, which I think says a lot about the school's commitment to mental health first aid, but also the energy and the enthusiasm in which the staff have embraced this opportunity has been really, really encouraging. So were I a parent in your shoes, and knowing Tracy as I do from my previous days, because Tracy Hanford was, once upon a time, a middle leader when I was a deputy head. So I've known Tracy for many years, and knowing her passion and her energy that goes around safeguarding, mental health and safeguarding, you're in very, very good hands within the Poponi family. So I'm really pleased, as I said, to be here, but also very encouraged by what I've heard and seen thus far. Just a little bit of background, and I promise I won't spend too much time at this stage because it's relevant, but it's not hugely relevant. I'm a recently retired head teacher, 14 years in a prep school, but prior to that, took the fairly traditional way through teaching as initially a class teacher, senior master, deputy head, and have worked in a variety of schools. I'm an NPQH. I know that's something Graham's doing at the moment. I was awarded the NPQH some years ago. I inspect for ISI. More recently, I've become a Level 7 executive coach and mentor, so I work with newly appointed heads. I also am MHFA and NUCO trained as an instructor and a senior designated mental health lead. But what I'm not, folks, is I'm not a counsellor, I'm not a psychiatrist. The vast majority of what I'm going to talk to you about today has been through my training in mental health, but also my experience as a head. I'm currently involved, as you can see, in running courses and training in the areas of wellbeing and leadership. Trained over 400 teachers thus far. I like these two quotes because the message they give very, very early on is that the more we can be doing to prevent mental health first aid challenges occurring, the better. So a lovely quote. At present, Anthony Selden, former headmaster of both Brighton College and Wellington College, too many schools wait for problems to manifest and then try dealing with them at the bottom of the waterfall. We should be working at the top of the waterfall, preventing people from falling over the edge. Common sense, but actually a little bit harder to implement if the teachers do not have the skills and the training. Because I can assure you, one of the challenges for teachers is if they haven't got the confidence and the skills and the knowledge, the danger is they will fear getting it wrong in terms of what they say to children, and as a result they may end up saying nothing. And the whole point about mental health first aid training is we look to give them the skills, the confidence and the knowledge to deal with your children when they see the signs and the symptoms. And the areas of the MHFA are anxiety, depression, suicide, self-harm, eating disorders and psychosis. So it's quite a wide range of mental health challenges that we cover. And certainly the feedback from the last 3 days was that staff feel already far more equipped to deal with your children should they be presenting with mental health challenges. A little bit closer to home, Desmond Tutu, there comes a point when we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. Similar message. Let's have a look at some UK statistics, which I have to say make pretty grim reading. I'll let you digest those for yourself. I think it's worth pointing out that the fifth statistic on there tells you that 1/5 of children undertaking GCSE or its equivalent are feeling sufficiently anxious, or they're encountering enough stress and anxiety for them to turn to self-harming as a coping mechanism. Now that's high, that's 1 in 5 we have in the UK at the moment. 13% suffering from significantly debilitating anxiety before the age of 19. The bottom statistic, please take that for what it is. The notion of suicidal thinking at the initial end of the continuum is not that unusual. So to have thoughts about suicide is not that unusual. It's the progression into formulating a plan, and then, as we can imagine, the notion of completing a suicide. So it's still high. It's still 1/4 of young people will experience a degree of suicidal thinking. So there's still a lot of work to be done. It's what drives me these days, and I know it's what drives an awful lot of people. I have spoken to the staff in the days I've been here, and I've given them a mountain of resources which are largely either UK or internationally based. My hope is that when they've digested these and had an opportunity to look at them, is that they will relay this on to you. So a big part of the mental health first aid training is that they should be in a better position to signpost you as parents as to where to find support, resources, etc. Because I'm very aware that the situation in Kenya is very different. So for example, during the COVID period, my school, which was located just outside Norwich, had 2 registered charities that were specifically set up to deal with bereavement and helping children deal with bereavement. Now those were services you could call upon, they would come into the school, they would speak to staff, they would be available for children. What a fabulous resource. Now I'm very mindful that you're not in that fortunate position here, but a lot of these organisations and agencies and trusts have information, and some of them have international links. So I'm hoping again that the information I've shared with staff will come your way in due course. So be encouraged by that as well, please. If you can have a little look at this mental health curriculum. The importance of this is for people to recognise that young people will often move around this continuum. An age-old notion was that there was simply the horizontal axis and people appeared at some point on that axis from no diagnosis to severe diagnosis. We have to recognise that circumstances, situations, the environment, a raft of reasons will move children around this quadrant. We worked yesterday on the notion that clearly the best quadrant to be in is this top right-hand quadrant. No mental illness, no disorder, and positive mental health. However, there will be children who will have a diagnosis of mental illness. That doesn't mean that they can't be functioning and having positive mental health. They will simply be in that top left quadrant. So I think as parents, I want you to recognise that if your child has a mental illness and is diagnosed as such, it doesn't mean they're going to sit in either one of those 2 bottom quadrants. It means every effort will be made by the school, obviously in conjunction with yourself, to ensure that they're coping and they're functioning. There's a danger of labelling for obvious reasons. We talked about that at length yesterday. Stigma, discrimination, the language that we use. We try to talk, for example, about children having an episode of, which suggests a beginning and an end. We talked about somebody experiencing rather than suffering. And there's subtle differences, but they're important. Staff were reminded that they lead on this, but similarly they need to be picking up inappropriate language, inappropriate gesturing with the children in the school. And I know Graham was keen to just ensure that was, it's good. In fact, I suspect it's very good, but as ever, it can be better. And we looked at strategies and ways in which we'll be tackling that in the time ahead. So which children are at a higher risk of developing a mental health problem? Those with diagnosed learning difficulties. The statistic actually is 30%, so it's 30% higher in children who have a learning difficulty. As you might imagine, school can often be a stressful experience for them. They may be struggling to access the curriculum at times. They will certainly be mindful of the fact that some of their peers are performing better than they are. And that rises to 40% for any children with an autistic profile. So statistically, children who have diagnosed learning difficulties will find a higher incidence of mental health challenges. Those children that have spent time in care, and as I say, I work with children, often from a very young age, who come from a care environment, and sadly, what we call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, start as early as in utero, in the womb. All the research and evidence these days suggests the child that lives, or in those years before they arrive in the world, if they're in an environment where there is domestic violence, abuse, shouting, that has a direct impact on their brain from a very, very early age. So these adverse childhood experiences that we talk about can happen before the child arrives into the world. 3 adverse childhood experiences would suggest that somebody has actually experienced a great deal as a young person. And it can be bereavement, it can be separation that's not gone particularly well within the family environment, domestic violence, abuse, whatever that might be. So we need to be mindful of adverse childhood experiences and the impact those have on children. As I mentioned, neglect, domestic violence, etc. We also can't escape from the fact that genetically, if there has been poor mental health within the extended family, and particularly with the parents, there is a higher likelihood of children experiencing mental health challenges themselves. Now, these are not absolute concrete facts, so please don't assume that A will lead to B, but this is statistically where we are. And those children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So why are young people especially vulnerable? And I'm aware, just having spoken to 1 or 2 people here today, that we've got a range of parents in the room today. Those of you with young children thinking what lies ahead. Those of you with teenagers who are probably very aware of these teenage years. And perhaps others who may have very, very young children and are just here because they want to glean as much information as possible. So I'm not going to go into great neurobiological detail today. All I will tell you is that the 2 areas you can see here, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, play a very, very important part in those teenage years. Because the amygdala works a little bit like an accelerator in a car. That's what pushes and drives a young person in their teenage years to push those boundaries, to be confrontational at times, to be driven, to be push. You invariably need to act as the brakes, and in many respects the parents will be that prefrontal cortex. Because, here's the worrying bit, folks, the prefrontal cortex does not finish developing until the age of about 22 to 24. So, it's no surprise that the amygdala has way more influence in those teenage years than it does otherwise. So what we need to be thinking to ourselves is there's a lot going on in the teenage brain, and it's not the same as the adult brain. So when you're standing next to your teenager and you're thinking, why doesn't he or she understand what appears concretely clear to you? It's because their brains are wired differently. We'll move on from that slide because the next one gives me a little bit of a breather, but actually, all being well, it should, sorry, the next slide, there's somebody going to talk to us a little bit about these changes in the teenage brain. Before I do that, it's probably worth picking up on the third point here, that research is showing that teenage children have a great deal of difficulty with neutral expressions. So when you think you've got your, I'm being very understanding here, and I couldn't be more helpful if I tried, and you're getting the what response, it's because they're not reading your facial expressions particularly well. And again, research is suggesting that we need to be mindful of this. So whilst we can't excuse adolescents and teenagers for everything, when we think these boundaries are being pushed too far, we need to have some understanding, we need to have these discussions, just recognise that there's a lot going on in the teenage brain. And as I said, I'd like just to show you a little clip.
Adolescence is a pre-programmed neurobiological event, and to explain it to you, what I want to do is have a look at the basic neurochemistry of what's going on as adolescence strikes. So here we have the axes of our graph. Here is 8 to 9 years of age, approximately. Here is 18 to 20 years of age, also approximately. And what I want to talk about is two neurochemicals, the first of which is called serotonin. Now, all of you, I'm sure, have heard of serotonin in the context of adult depression, where serotonin levels are not sufficient, and we give drugs, the SSRIs, which are the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, to improve serotonin levels in the brain, which is a good way of trying to treat depression. Serotonin levels in the ordinarily developing brain gradually increase during childhood and adolescence before plateauing out in adulthood. I'm going to tell you in a second what that serotonin is doing, but first of all, I want us to think about another neurochemical called dopamine. Dopamine, I'm sure you've heard of in the context of the adult disease, very sad and tragic condition, Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's disease, the brain stops making enough dopamine and the brain becomes increasingly less functional. Now, dopamine has multiple functions in the brain. It's critical for learning, it's critical for unlearning, it's critical for paying attention. But one of its core, very basic functions is to bring nerve cells up to a level of excitation where they're just about to fire, but not quite. A bit like a sprinter on the starting blocks waiting for the starter's gun. These nerve cells sit, waiting to fire. Along comes a little bit of oomph from a neurochemical called glutamate. Off they fire and start doing their job in the brain. Dopamine levels during childhood gradually increase, but stay with a close ratio with serotonin. Why? Well, the answer is because if your brain is full of dopamine, is flooded with dopamine, it's hyperactive. It's sitting at a level of excitation which is not functional and useful. I'm sure all of you have at one point in your life experienced a sudden episode of stress. And you find, woo, I can't think clearly, I can't make decisions, I don't know what I'm doing. That's because stress floods your brain with dopamine, just like alcohol, just like drugs of addiction. All these things flood the brain with dopamine and make it less functional. So what you want is to be able to control the level of activation of your nerve cells so dopamine isn't able to push them up into this hyperexcitable state. And that's serotonin's job. Well, it's one of its many jobs, is it brings the activation of nerve cells down, makes it more difficult for them to fire. Now, a simple example of that is if I want to move my right hand up and down in the air, I don't want my left leg and left arm shaking about in the air at the same time. The serotonin levels in my brain keep the left arm and left leg calmed down, so I can now only activate the nerve cells that I want to move my right hand up and down. All very straightforward. What happens with the onset of puberty, however, is that dopamine levels suddenly shoot up before gradually coming down again and settling back to the pre-adolescent ratio with serotonin. Now, what this means is you've way too much dopamine in your brain and not enough serotonin. So your brain becomes hyperexcitable. And this is normal neurobiology. It is wired into you, it's genetically predetermined, and all adolescents do it. Why? Why? Well, because what nature wants is adolescents to take high-risk decisions with poor judgment, because then they achieve two critical goals. They break free of their dependence on their parents, and they learn how to interface with their peer group by trial and error so they can become successful as adults. This dopamine surge, we think, is the reason as well why adolescence is the commonest time to develop depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, for autistic spectrum disorder to reveal itself with behavioral problems, Tourette syndrome, and also addiction. All these things have their peak onset in adolescence, and the reason almost certainly is because of this dopamine surge, which produces this brain which takes high-risk decisions with poor judgment. Dopamine is our critical chemical in the brain to make your brain run normally. We know that people who are depressed, who have schizophrenia, who have bipolar disorder, who are addicted, their brains are not functioning normally and well. Dopamine is therefore the critical neurochemical in almost all of our brains functioning. As I've said to you, dopamine is critical for learning and unlearning. Dopamine is critical for paying attention. Dopamine, in the right concentrations at the right time, produces health in our brains. Not just emotional health, but all our brain activities depend on dopamine. In a therapeutic situation, therefore, where you're trying to support someone and help them feel capable and able of dealing with the situations and problems that they're trying to make sense of, dopamine is your critical friend. If you can produce dopamine in the right concentration, in the right places, you have maximized that person's ability to deal with whatever challenges or issues are facing them at that time. You are giving them the strength to move forward. What we now understand about dopamine and dopamine secretion is that 93% of dopamine secretion in the brain, 93%, is directly under the control of your limbic emotional brain. I think anyone who has any sense recognizes that if you have someone's heart, their minds will come with them. Now, for me as a neurobiologist, heart is not this thing pumping away in your chest. It's actually the limbic emotional brain, what we've just been talking about. Now, the limbic emotional brain is controlling 93% of dopamine secretion. So you need to engage with that if you're going to support and help that person. This comes down to the oldest algorithm in the book, which all of you there who have any experience of dealing and supporting people with emotional illness or emotional problems knows that if someone is in an environment where they feel understood, then that is good for their self-esteem. If those two things are true, then that's good for their self-confidence. And if those three things exist within that person, then they will feel emotionally engaged with the situation. And as I've already explained, if they feel emotionally engaged, it means their limbic emotional brain is fully connected with what's going on. And if that's the case, then you've optimized their dopamine secretion, you've maximized their ability to not only deal with the situation in the present, but also to learn or unlearn the things that they got wrong, the things that they got right, to give them strategies to move forward. And of course, what this comes down to is the oldest understanding of human behavior that there is. If somebody's in an environment or with someone where they feel genuine love, then their ability to deal with themselves and their lives is maximized. And this, of course, doesn't have to be some deep, profound Hollywood love. Just the sense of being understood, of your self-esteem and self-confidence being maximized, and of feeling safe, emotionally engaged in the environment you're in.
Watch it again in your own time if you so wish. What I would say is there will be a number of bits and pieces you could take from that, but just be mindful, as I said a little earlier, the teenage brain is not the same as the adult brain. This dopamine surge that we hear about, the prefrontal cortex taking time to develop, and therefore the amygdala having way more influence during those years, will explain some of the challenges that you will encounter as your child goes through adolescence. I won't explain all of them, but it'll hopefully give you just a little bit more opportunity to think there's more going on here than I perhaps had originally realized. But these blow-ups, they will occur. If you haven't had a teenager and a blow-up as yet, it's on the horizon. And if you've gone through your entire parenting experience with a teenager and not having had a blow-up, then you should be up here rather than me, I suspect. So the point is, how do we deal with these blow-ups? If we can imagine that teenagers are actually very much like giant toddlers. So what worked with a toddler may well be an approach to take with a teenager. Food, for example. You know, toddlers screaming on the floor in the supermarket, you know, the food notion, have this, have that. You know, food is a good thing. Food provides a comfort, as does giving them time to calm down. Allow that prefrontal cortex to kick back in, because the likelihood is the amygdala is running wild, and the danger, of course, is if we think to ourselves, it's up to me now to deal with somebody who is in a fight and flight mode, amygdala racing along, there's every likelihood the situation is going to get worse. So words are often unheard when a young person, sorry, I'd forgotten about this again, when a young person is in a fight or flight mode. Welcome, Mrs. Hanford, good to see you. So think toddler. A couple of phrases that I think work very well. One is just tell me more. You can very rarely go wrong with tell me more. Just a case of, I'm listening, I'm hearing what you're saying, tell me more. And almost playing the role of a dummy. You know, have I missed something? What have I missed? Just help me understand, rather than I know best because I'm the adult, you're the child, we're going to play the power game here and I'm going to win. Better just to sit back and say, just help me out here, what have I missed? Two very useful ways of diffusing these situations. Try to avoid the 1950s parenting approach. And you know exactly what I mean by that, which is, don't you dare talk to me like that. Just wait till your father gets home. We revert to those type of comments when we feel helpless, when we feel as if we're out of our depth, and we reach back and we pick up what was probably thrown at us at that age. I would tell you, having spent a lot of time with teenage children, it's probably the least effective approach, is this threat of, go to your room, wait till your father gets home, don't you dare speak to me like that. You're far better placed to think to yourself, I'm probably not going to immediately fix this problem. I need to give the situation, and I need to give this young person and myself some time and space. Listen as non-judgmentally as you can. You might think you've got all the answers, but that's not what they want you to listen for. They want you to listen openly and non-judgmentally and hear them out. What is it that they're trying to tell you? It's hard, very, very hard, because you think you know best and you think you've got the answer to what the challenge is, but the minute you're waiting to finish their sentence, there's every likelihood in their own mind they've just stopped listening. There's no point. And there will obviously be the times when you think to yourself, I've just got to take some distance from this situation because I'm going to end up saying something I regret. The situation's going to get worse. So there's nothing wrong with you thinking to yourself, I just need some distance from this. Let the prefrontal cortex kick back in again and try again a little bit later. So these are just some suggestions. I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, and I'm going to tell you that in my view, and Graham and I talked about this yesterday and it gave him a wry grin, I would say there has been a rise in what we call the curling parent. If you go back to having watched a game of curling, the notion is that somebody rolls a stone along the ice with the idea of getting it as close to a target area as possible. And it's a competition to roll the stone to that closest point. There's somebody, however, who is running around in front of this stone, brushing furiously at the ice, removing every single particle, obstacle in its way to try and get it to actually go into the right place. My view is we have more parents that think, if I remove every possible obstacle in my child's path, that's going to help enormously. I would argue strongly that you're going to have to let them experience those ups and downs, and you know, if that means that they fail at something, that's going to help them develop that resilience that will support them enormously when they do have challenges, and they won't immediately fall down because they've experienced nothing like that before, because the curling parent has removed every obstacle. It's a thought, it's one I've dwelt on quite a lot, and certainly, surprise, surprise, the teachers agreed that we've had a rise in curling parents. You know, whether you see it for yourselves, I'm not too sure. It's not a criticism, because I know it's born out of love, but I'm just not absolutely sure it helps the child with this need to build up resilience. And this isn't something I've discussed yet with Tracy, but now wouldn't be a bad time, really. If the school is able to organise opportunities for parents to meet, to discuss similar challenges and experiences, it's incredibly helpful, because we've lost that sort of school gate notion that certainly I remember well, where parents hovered at the school gate and they talked. So it may need the school to help organise this, where you deliberately invite parents who've been through those teenage years with their child, to support those who've got adolescence on the horizon. It's a very good way of sharing the concerns, and in many cases realising there's not as much to be fearful and anxious about as it appears. And I'm mindful that the theme of this is to talk to you about supporting teenagers, but you know, they do go through these bumps in the road, and many of them may go through adolescence causing you very few problems whatsoever. But I would wager that there'll be a handful of people in here who will have some very difficult teenage years to cope with. But my point is, if the school's happy to facilitate that, you know, with the expressed intention of saying, let's bring parents together across a wide range who would be keen to talk about the experiences of their child going through adolescence. And similarly, you know, prepare yourself for adolescence. It's very, very easy to think, well, you know, 8 and 9, they couldn't do more to please, they couldn't be more cooperative, and then something happens, and we know what it happens, the dopamine surge, the amygdala, etc. Something happens and you suddenly get a very, very different child on your hands. What I would say is it's worth recognising that if a child is coming across as being bolshy, bad-tempered, aggressive, sullen, etc., try to think to yourself, I don't have a bad-tempered child, I don't have a sullen child, I don't have an aggressive child, I've probably got an anxious child. There's something going on somewhere that is unsettling this child. So try and think, I've got an anxious child here rather than I've got a bolshy, difficult, aggressive child. And be very, very careful, as I said, with the sort of labelling. It rarely helps. Your own upbringing and the impact on your standpoints is far greater than you'll realise. So, perversely at times, the person that resented the very, very, very formal upbringing they had will still believe, well, that's the way I was brought up, therefore that's the way I should be bringing my child up. And if it's not working, there's probably time for you to do some self-reflection and think, well, actually, did it really work for me? Am I only presenting this front because it's what I assume is the right way to do things, rather than what I think is going to work for my child? So trust yourself and your knowledge of your child, but there might be a little bit of self-reflection needed to understand your own upbringing and how and why that's had such a strong influence. I mentioned this notion of needing to discuss. It might be a partner, husband, wife, friend, whatever, but I think it's a useful exercise to say, actually, what do you think? What did you experience as a wife, as a husband? Are we on the same page? My wife was brought up in Holland, and whilst we're of a similar age, a very, very different upbringing in Holland than the UK. And there were times, certainly during parenting of our teenagers, where we were on a different page, but it was valuable to know and understand that. Another exercise I think is quite useful. If you're struggling with your child, is just give yourself a little bit of space and sit down and, what I would say, sketch out their life. And by that, I mean have a little look at this next little diagram, which talks about a stress bucket. So are you aware of what is going into your child's stress bucket? I'm sure you are, but sometimes it's worth thinking, what are they contending with at the moment? What's going into their stress bucket? Similarly, are there ways in which they have helpful coping strategies? And I'm sure one of them is the ability to talk openly with yourself, but there are other coping strategies. Do they get enough exercise? Have they got an interest? Are you cultivating their interests? Do they recognise that friends and family will be there for them whatever, unconditionally? And similarly, the unhelpful coping strategies, and I suspect all of us have either been through further education or been somewhere beyond the age of living with our parents, so we know what's out there. We know that there are unhelpful coping strategies, over-reliance on alcohol, recreational drugs, all the things that we fear for our children. But ideally, if they have enough helpful coping strategies, we can be encouraging them to call upon those when they feel there's so much going into my stress bucket, rather than relying on the unhelpful coping strategies. And the vulnerability which we all have, the size of the bucket reflects the vulnerability. So a bigger bucket will mean you're able to absorb more of the ups and downs, the stresses of life. If you have a very small stress bucket, then sadly there's every likelihood that it will overspill very, very quickly. So again, what are we doing with our children to try and prepare them for the stresses of life, which we know as adults will be there? There will be these ups and downs. I've put together, and we've touched on some of these, 8 top tips. I'm particularly confident that Tracy and her team will be more than receptive and actually very disappointed if you don't feel you can come to the school and talk about any of the challenges your child is facing. So my point is, communicate with the school. It works so much better if there's this two-way communication where you're receptive at times to hearing about some of the challenges your child may be having, but also you're bringing them to the school. Because it's very difficult. And a little example would be, as a headmaster, one of the most frustrating things is if parents would come to see me, and I've had this a number of times, to say, we, the pair of us, are thinking about a separation. And we are largely committed to that. We haven't told the children yet. We're telling you because we're going to tell them in the near future, but please don't tell anybody. Please don't tell them. We don't need the teachers to know. So that's hugely unhelpful, because what I'm waiting for, as best I can, is this child to digest this information and quite possibly fall apart. But of course, if the teachers don't know that this is what's going on, it manifests itself in poor behaviour, etc., etc. and the response from the teacher may be disproportionate to the situation had they known what the situation is. So be open and share the challenges that you feel your child might be experiencing with the school. Listen to your child, even if you feel they don't listen to you. You know, give them that time. Just sit on your hands and listen. Doesn't mean you have to fix things. It doesn't mean you have to have an answer, but just listen to them. Try to avoid judging. Negative remarks have 3 times the impact of positive remarks. Just think about that as a situation. Accept your child for the person they are. Just be careful with aspirations. And that's not me suggesting for a second that we shouldn't be aspirational for our children to be the best that they can be. But the best that they can be doesn't necessarily... I'm sure you know the point I'm making. Just be careful with putting too much pressure on young people. I mentioned the empathy, focusing on what's really important. Well, that's not for me to tell you what's really important within your relationship with your child, but I suspect everybody in the room just wants their child to be happy, wants them to recognise that they're loved and valued, and let's just keep that front and centre. Always take dark thoughts seriously. Remain vigilant and model emotional honesty. And by that I mean, you know, if a child is telling you that they're having dark thoughts, if they're, you know, don't brush them aside, don't sort of minimise them, don't disregard them, don't tell them that's not, you know, that's not happening. Take them seriously. And again, talk to the school. You will have a lot of staff trained to a certain level now. From what I can gather, Tracy, you've got some fabulous counsellors in your midst as well who are all very highly trained with regard to helping children in this situation. And again, help your child understand that all storms pass. Back to this idea that there are ups and downs in life. You know, we know that as adults. It's quite difficult for young people, I think, to recognise that all storms do pass. This is just a little recap, really, of where I know Tracy and the school are at the moment. So they're embracing the MHFA training. They're giving some thought to this Wellbeing Award for schools, which is an 18-month journey where they take on board the views of all the stakeholders, of course, including yourself. They already have a trained senior designated mental health lead, which is somebody who's putting a plan together, ensuring all the staff are aware and engaged in the planning of mental health support for the children. I know Tracy well enough to know that one of the reasons that she asked me over was she does have a very strong commitment to establishing a school culture and ethos where the well-being and mental health of staff and pupils is recognised and being of paramount importance. So I've no concerns whatsoever, and neither should you, with regard to this culture and ethos. The growth mindset, I could probably spend half an hour on that, and I'm not going to do. If you're not aware of the growth mindset ethos, it basically centres around the notion that we will be saying to children, they'll say, I can't do it, and they finish the sentence with yet. It's this idea that you can, if you persist, if you show resilience, all the soft skills that are so important within the development of a young person are centred around this idea that there is no ceiling to people's progress. So this growth mindset ethos and the recognition that resilience can be taught. So we move to the final slide, which again, given this is being recorded, is something you might want to digest in your own time. But for me, I would be saying if the school can put a tick against each of these 10 points, then they could be considering themselves a mentally healthy school. And I'm just going to quickly run through these. A dynamic commitment to being proactive, introducing preventative strategies before the need arises, so all the way back to slide 1, whilst providing staff with the training, skills and confidence. Staff, children and parents all understand that emotional well-being is a prerequisite of academic success. The examination tail does not wag the school dog. It's just this little reminder that academic success is not everything. The programme of talks, webinars, workshops exist for parents, including advice about technology and social media. All staff feel they're valued and have a stake in the school, and the importance of staff wellbeing is recognised. Social and emotional learning, the importance of self-awareness, self-confidence, that these are not just taught as separate items in the PSHE curriculum, but they're woven into the fabric of the school. And I can see already with the prefect system and the mentors and the buddy system just how keen the school are to give these children these responsibilities. I think this is an important one. Asking for help is seen as a strength and not a weakness. You know, that's not just for the children, that's for the staff. We need to be mindful that a school that puts out the notion that we need to be nervous about coming forward is likely to find itself with far more problems than one that's open and welcoming. A clear link existing between teachers, counsellors and outside agencies, and again I'm hoping these outside agencies that I've provided to the staff will filter their way through to you. That's certainly the plan. A coaching culture, again I'm not going to go into that in great depth, but essentially what that says is that if the leaders in an organisation are able to give a little bit more responsibility and recognise that people within their organisation can take on levels of responsibility, then far less needs to come through to the top. And a perfect example will be the mental health first aiders over the last couple of days will be able to deal with some of the problems now that would have previously shuttered straight through to the counsellor. So the counsellor, of course, can find themselves overwhelmed with at times challenges, mental health challenges that can be dealt with now by the staff who will have the confidence and the skills to undertake that. This coaching culture says just listen a little more, ask questions and spend a little less time thinking that you've got all the answers. Staff having the time and the inclination to listen, engage, earn trust and build connections. And finally, the school continuing to recognise that ethos and environment requires constant input and reinforcement when it comes to the importance of mental health and well-being. Ladies and gents, we said that we'd be looking at about an hour, and I think that's just about where we've got to. I'm more than happy to take questions now. Similarly, I'm not in a rush to disappear, so I will be around for a little while longer if people want to come up and chat with me on a more sort of individual basis.